Texas A&M leads the SEC when it comes to returning production for next season.
You are Locked On Aggies, your daily podcast on the Texas A&M Aggies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome on into Locked On Aggies. I'm your host, Andrew Stefaniak. Thanks for making Locked On Aggies your first listen every single day. On the show today, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking a little bit about the injury to Gavin Grahovac. We'll get to that at the tail end. We're going to talk about a list that ranked the top 100 returning players in college football, and I have a lot of issues with this list. But we're going to start the show talking about returning production. Returning production is always an incredibly important statistic for every single team, for every single conference. And when you look at returning production for Texas A&M, it is a big plus for this team. So overall, the Aggies lead the SEC in returning production. They have their offense is ranked 19th from all the schools, and their defense is ranked 12th, puts them 6th overall in all of college football. So, and the reason that is like a great example here is Oklahoma. They're returning on offense is 6th, so they returning a lot on offense, but then on defense, it's 46, and it's kind of a stat where you're seeing a lot of players come back for the Aggies, and that's huge. I mean, think about you're returning all your running backs, you're returning all of your offensive line, your quarterback, you're returning a lot of players in your linebacker room and your secondary. You're losing some defensive linemen and you're losing some players from different miscellaneous positions. But for the most part, I mean, you got to be fired up. I think this is a big reason. It's one thing. One reason I've been so positive of late on the Aggies, and I've made the point. I know that folks are not going to believe in Texas A&M until they prove it on the field. I get all of it. I do understand, but at the same time, when looking at this Texas A&M team, I mean, it's hard to not be excited and believe in them, knowing how much they're returning. I mean, once again, you're returning your entire offensive line, your entire running back room, and your quarterback. So if you really do the mental math on it, the position on offense that you had to add to, you bring in a ton of receivers that are going to help you. We'll talk about that in a minute. And you bring in a couple tight ends. I mean, you've gotten your players that were really good besides those few defensive linemen that moved on to the NFL. You returned, and then the positions where you struggled, you brought in new talent. So, I mean, Texas A&M's in this spot. It's really, I think this is a reason when folks, will say, well, we're going to hear this. You're going to hear it, Texas A&M fans. You're going to hear it every day, whether you're in a gas station wearing a Texas A&M t-shirt or you're on an airplane going to another state or whatever, and you're wearing Texas A&M gear. You're going to hear, well, Texas A&M, I don't, they're overrated every year. What's going to be different this year? I mean, I think that a great stat to throw at them is, and I always, blue chip ratio is a big one for me. Yeah, this one now returning production. You're returning all this production from a football team that won 8 football games and had a chance, besides the implosion toward the end of the year with the losses to Auburn and South Carolina and Texas. I mean, was in a position where they really could have made a playoff and made an SEC championship game. They exploded toward the end, but point is, it's a pretty darn good football team that even in some of those losses, they lose a heartbreaker to Auburn. They hung around for the most part with, Notre Dame. I mean, that was a different team from the team we saw at the end of the year. But point is, it was a good football team that you're returning a lot of players from. Obviously, losing Shamar Turner and Shamar Stewart and Nick Scorton is going to hurt. You're losing NFL wide receivers. I mean, there's no debate that that's going to cause some issues, and you're going to have to find a way to replace those guys. I mean, that's just the reality. So I think that at the end of the day, it's a stat that you can throw at folks to say this is why Texas A&M is going to be better than people think next year. Now, I think that Texas A&M, I mean, I bet our when everything's finalized, our over-under on wins will be set at 8.5, probably, maybe 7.5. But I think that I think it has to be 8.5 because I think that 8 is the most realistic outcome, if I had to guess. And I think if you did 7-5, people love to bet over. So you'd rather make a bet in over that's going to probably be tougher to get to. So, that's my point. So, I think our over-unders, we said 8.5 wins, which the reason I bring that up and the reason I think it's important is because it shows you, hey, this Texas A&M team is going to be pretty good. Returning production, that's the point. If you're returning production on a 1-11 football team, it's like, well, who cares? You know what I mean? Okay, cool. You're returning terrible players. Great. But Texas A&M, once again, aside from those great defensive linemen who are moving on to the NFL, is returning elite, good football players that are going to hopefully help you make a run in the college football playoff. Now, yes, we've discussed this. This is the reality. We've talked about it. At the end of the day, there are tons of concerns with this position. There are a ton of concerns with this position. Brain fart. There are a ton of concerns with the schedule for me. And yes, and every time I bring up the schedule, I'm always going to reiterate this point because some folks crap at it. But the reality is, yes, you are. It is a. When I always say it's a tough schedule, people say, well, you don't play Georgia or Alabama or Ole Miss or Tennessee, and I'm like, yes, you're right. It's true. You do get very lucky in that fact, but at the same time, it's tougher than last year. So I think that's the way I should probably start explaining it. It's tougher than last year's because you're playing these same teams that you're more than capable of beating, but a lot of the more challenging teams you're going on the road. Then you've also got the Floridas and South Carolinas and Auburns of the world who we all think are going to be a lot better this year. But so let's go ahead and look at your opponents for this year and see where they land on this list. So you've got for your opponents, you've got Florida at 4, Auburn at 5, Mississippi State at 7, LSU at 8, Missouri at 9. You've got Arkansas at 12, South Carolina at 13, and Texas at 14. So, the highest Vandy's number 2 and Oklahoma's number 3. You don't play either of those teams. Now Missouri is the final team they're 51, so we'll call them around the top 50. So there's a lot of SEC teams that are returning some production. Then you've got your Ole Miss and Georgia and Texas of the world that are outside the top 100, and they're really losing a lot of players. And now it makes sense. That's the reality. A lot of those players are moving on to the NFL and starting their careers at the next level. It's not like that comes as a big surprise, but we're still in a position right now where this Texas A&M team has so much exciting talent left on this roster. And that gets me that's this is a big stat for me. This in blue chip ratio, because they don't guarantee that it's going to click, but they show you why there's a chance it could. I mean, and it's why, I remember my first year doing Locked On Aggies when I would go on the radio or go on other folks' podcasts or whatever, and people would say, well, I mean, how can you try and defend Jimbo Fisher or make a case for why his team could be good? And my case would always be the reason this team can be good is because they have the talent to be good. Whether or not they end up being good, we'll see. It's going to be up to the coaching staff. It's going to be up to, development and all that. But they have the talent to be good. And I think that you can make a similar argument with this Texas A&M team for 2025 and say, listen, this roster has the talent and has the returning veteran production to be one of the better teams in the SEC. So, I mean, I think it's a break room stat to throw at folks that say, well, Texas A&M's overrated. They're returning a lot of production on a football team that was a real collapse away from making a playoff. I mean, it was a real, or at least making a great bowl game, whatever. So I think that's a stat you can throw at some folks. It's a big deal for me. I mean, this was texted in the Locked On, group chat. And it was really interesting to me because I was like, hey, you know what? I think that this shows how good Texas A&M can be if they click. So that is why that stat meant so much to me. We're going to talk a little bit about a list that broke down the top 100 returning players in college football. There's 2 Aggies listed and a bunch of Aggies that are left off, and I'm angry about it. And I'm going to tell you why coming up right here on Locked On Aggies. But first, I got to tell you about our wonderful friends over at Prize Picks. March basketball is here, and there's no better way to get in on the action than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With Prize Picks, you pick more or less on at least 2 player projections, and if you're right, you can win up to $1,000 extra cash. It's fast, easy, and keeps every game exciting. There's a lot of fun stats to look at. This, I think Tatum's going to have a great week in the NBA this week. I'd look at taking his over on points. I think Luka Doncic is starting to heat up in a Laker uniform. I think that you're never going to see a Luka Doncic line below 32.5 points for a long time. So, I'd take advantage of it while you can. I love how I can make my picks in less than 60 seconds and stay engaged all game long. It's easy to use, and it just makes the game more fun. Download the app and use code LOCKEDONCollege. Get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONCollege for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. So a list came out from the College Football Network, College Sports Network, excuse me. And they're a place that I like their stuff. And this is a fun article. It's a good conversation piece. But they listed the top 100 returning players in college football, and there were only 2 Aggies listed. The 2 Aggies listed were at number 58, Casey Concepcion. The blurb about him said, a CS in freshman All-American in 2023, Kevin Concepcion, Casey Concepcion, had something of a down year as a part of a relatively anemic NC State Wolfpack offense. However, his transfer to Texas A&M Aggies should reignite one of the most talented and versatile pass catchers in all of college football. I agree with that. This is interesting. For those of you that haven't seen this list from College Sports Network, I mean, there's the next player is listed 1 spot ahead of Concepcion. And I want you all to take a guess before I tell you. I'm going to give you 5 seconds. Take a guess who you think it might be, because I promise you, I bet if I gave you 10 guesses, you wouldn't guess it. So, give you 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, well, who's your guess? I'll tell you. It is none other than the Iowa State transfer, Tyler Onyenum. It says, although his pure numbers don't scream top 100 talent, 13 tackles for loss and 3 sacks in 4 seasons with the Iowa State Cyclones, the Texas A&M Aggies snagged one of the most important defensive linemen in the winter transfer portal window, is what the blurb had to say about Onyenum. I mean, that is high praise for a player in Onyenum that we anticipate coming in and really helping this defensive line and boosting this unit. And, it's definitely going to be a concern for this team as the defensive line, knowing everything you lost, and you've brought in some players, but I still think you might not be done yet. But I mean, if you would have told me, like, I'm serious, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the players I would have guessed would have been on this list before Tyler Onyenum. I'm not saying I think he's a great player. I think he's going to have a massive season for us. He's going to be he's one of the best run stoppers in college football, in my opinion. So that really tells me how good he is that he's listed here. So I think breaking this down, the number one thing that I am taking a gander at, and the 10 players. So I'll give you this. I'm gonna keep naming players. Obviously I would have Concepcion I think is gonna be a top 10, maybe top 5 receiver in college football. Onyenum is the surprise for me. So if you would have told me that the Aggies have another player inside this list of top 100 players running in college football, and who would it be? I'm going to tell you all the players I would have guessed to be there before Onyenum. Le'Veon Moss, Trey Zune, Armaj Reed-Adams, maybe Terry Bussey. I could have seen him being like 97, 98, 99, 100 perhaps. But still not 100% there. Cassius Howell. Of course, obviously I knew Concepcion. Maybe Marcel Reed snuck into those last 5-10 spots. Will the Blanket Lee, Terry and York, I think are guys that you can see. Maybe you want to throw a DJ Hicks in there. There are a ton of players that I think that I would have been like, really? It's not that player? Before you would have said it's Tyler Yenneman, I'd been like, what? So I just find that really interesting. I don't hate it. Hey, good. That's great. I mean, he's a player that I think is going to be really good for this football team and is going to help us out. But I'm just telling you, it came as a little bit of a surprise. So, I mean, I think that the number one name that I'm really upset was not on this list would have to be Le'Veon Moss. There aren't, I don't care what anyone says. I don't care. There are not, 100 football players in college football better than Le'Veon Moss. There just aren't. Sorry. There are not 100 football players in college football better than Le'Veon Moss. That's just the reality. It's really crazy to me that's even a discussion. I mean, I don't know how you can look at what Le'Veon Moss did last year and say to yourself, he's not a top 10, maybe top 5 running back in college football. And you have to figure the top 5 at every position is going to be in that list, right? So, I mean, how in the world is Le'Veon Moss not on there? So, you know what? Let's go to this list. Here we go. Let's go to this list. Let's look at running backs that are in this, okay? Because I think this is part of it. So, running backs on this list. You got a kicker there. That's kind of weird. You got the Navy running back listed at 94. You have like this right here. Ted Hurst, wide receiver, Georgia State. I'm about to say George Strait. That's funny. You're telling me that Ted Hurst is a better football player than Le'Veon? Like, that is absolutely asinine to me that we're going to sit here and pretend like, no offense to that player. I'm sure he's a great football. I'm not saying he's a bad football player. What I'm saying is you're saying that he is a better football player than Le'Veon Moss. Like, that's just, I don't understand it. Like, I mean, so the running backs on this list, let's go. Jeremiah Love, understandable. Get that. I'm sure what's his name from Penn State's going to be somewhere on here. Ahmad Hardy at Missouri. Okay. He's a good player. That's the kid that came over from La Tech, right? Yeah, he's a good player. I'm fine with that. Now, is he a top 20 player in college football? That's a little crazy to me. Where is the one dude from Penn State? What's his name? I mean, there's just some running backs on here. Like, these players are not like Mekhi Hughes for running back. I mean, I know the name, good football player. He's not better than Le'Veon Moss. That's the frustration. You're telling me that guy that did that, I believe it was at Tulane, right? At Tulane. Or no. Yes, it was Tulane. You're telling me that play, I'm not knocking any of these football players. They're great players. They're going to be great. They're new schools, whatever. But you're telling me that guy is better than Le'Veon Moss. He's not. And that's incredibly frustrating to me. It's hard to see a world where, and I mean, like, Cassius Howell, like, I guess what I'm saying is, and I then you kind of get into the power for football, then everybody would be on the list, whatever. But you're telling me not to try and, but the, some of these players are better than like a Cassius Howell. Like, you're telling me Jason Henderson, the linebacker from Old Dominion, is better than Cassius Howell? Or, I mean, it's just not reality to me. I just don't see it. So I'm not trying to knock those players. I'm really not. The point of this argument is just like, I think there's a lot of Texas A&M players that should have been on this list that weren't. Le'Veon Moss for sure. Trey Jr., Mars Reed Adams, Will Lee. So to me, for sure, Le'Veon Moss, Cassius Howell, Will Lee, Trey Jr., Mars Reed Adams are the guys that I don't know how in the world, obviously Concepcion, how those guys weren't on the list, and it's crazy to me. But Were there any other players that were not on this list that y'all feel were snubbed or y'all feel were left off? Let me know in the YouTube comments. We're going to talk about the injury to Gavin Grahovac. We'll do that coming up right here on Locked On Aggies. So the Texas A&M baseball team received, I don't have a better word other than terrible news for the baseball team, as Gavin Grahovac, star, absolute elite player, was dominant last year. We're talking about a preseason All-American type of guy, is going to be out. He for the year because he's going to undergo a shoulder surgery. A guy that what I respect about this is that, you have a guy in Gavin Grahovac that is just going to fight through an injury, and he did everything in his power. Everything in his power to play through this, and he's just not going to be able to do it. And it's understandable. I mean, he's banged up, he's hurt. I get it. It sucks, but it's next man up mentality. I've seen some folks on social media tweeting stuff, talking about how doing the whole, we lost all these players in the we lost Braden Montgomery before Omaha, and we lost Le'Veon Moss, and we lost we've had basketball players into the lineup. I think that I don't want to sit here and be like, well, Texas A&M has worse injury luck than other schools. I don't, it's athletics. You're going to have injuries. I don't think we should be always making that excuse, but it is frustrating losing a player like Gavin Grahovac. Texas A&M's the number one team in college baseball, and you're now losing a player who was probably a top 10, 20 player in all the entire sport. It's a big loss. It's a massive loss for this team. And they're going to have to find a way to rally around each other in the next man up mentality. But if you asked me the straight, blunt question and said, listen, Andrew, do you believe there is a world where how much does this affect Texas A&M? And I'm going to say a great deal. This to me, losing a guy this good, it's not like you're losing a bench player that's not great. You're losing an elite All-American player. This does seriously, hurt my opinion on this team for the rest of the season. I think it's going to affect the Aggies. I think that, I think it's going to hurt your chances of winning the whole thing. I think that your chance of winning the whole thing went from 28%, maybe 25%, or whatever people want to say, I'm your number one team, to 15%, just like that, because of that injury. It's a big time injury. So, and anyone that says it's not, you're wrong. And I know it's the next man up mentality. And so we have great players. We're going to step up and we're going to be okay. And they're going to fight through it. We're going to coach through it. We're going to be all right. But at the end of the day, I'm just telling y'all, this is a big time loss for this team. And it's incredibly concerning, and it's just not good. So thoughts and prayers are with Gavin Grahovac as he gets ready to go through the surgery. And nothing worse, for an athlete than wanting to be out there with your teammates and you can't because you're hurt. So speedy recovery to him. He's going to be back stronger and better next year. Excited about that. Really respect him trying to fight through it, but he just couldn't. That's the reality. And he's got to get that surgery to get it fixed. So we'll have him back next year. Good to go. But you got to find a way. Next man up mentality. Find a way to win without him. That's what Texas A&M is going to have to do. That's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Aggies. Thank y'all so much for being here every single day. Really, really appreciate y'all. Hope everyone has a great rest of their Tuesday, and we will see you tomorrow right here on Locked On Aggies.